I found this crumpled note under your pillow. What does 'I can't go on like this' mean, Ben?" My husband froze, his eyes wide like a deer in headlights. After 30 years of marriage, I knew every nuance of his expression. The slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his brow furrowed ever so slightly, he was hiding something from me. "It's nothing, Ava, just some nonsense I scribbled down." Ben snatched the note from my hand, crumpling it further in his fist. I crossed my arms, my heart pounding. "Don't lie to me. We promised each other no more secrets, remember?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "You're right, I'm sorry. It's just—" He trailed off, averting his gaze. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tensions. I thought of our 2 grown children, Lila and Jessie, both out on their own now. Had our family become so fractured without me realizing? "Ben, talk to me," I pleaded, my voice catching in my throat. "Whatever it is, we can work through it together." He looked up at me then, his eyes brimming with a sadness I hadn't seen in years. "I don't know if we can, Ava. I've been feeling so trapped, like I'm living someone else's life." His words felt like a physical blow. We'd built this life together, a life centered around his family's hardware store and the home we'd made for our children. How could he feel trapped in the very existence he'd chosen? "What are you saying?" I asked, my hands trembling. "Are you unhappy with me? With us?" Ben reached for me, but I stepped back, my mind reeling. "It's not about you, Ava. It's about me and the choices I've made, the dreams I've let slip away." I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. We'd weathered so many storms together, only for him to crumble under the weight of some midlife crisis. But as I looked at my husband, truly looked at him, I saw the deep lines etched into his face, the weariness in his eyes. This was a man struggling under the burden of regrets and unfulfilled desires. In that moment, I realized our marriage had become a battlefield, with casualties on both sides. We'd been so focused on raising our children, on maintaining the status quo, that we'd lost sight of each other's needs. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Okay, Ben, I hear you. But we can't fix this if you don't let me in. No more secrets, remember?" He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with relief. "You're right. I owe you the truth." As he began to speak, I braced myself for the impact of his words, knowing that our lives were about to change forever. Ben's confession hung heavy in the air between us. I felt like I was suffocating, gasping for breath as the weight of his words threatened to crush me. "You're feeling trapped?" I echoed, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What about me, Ben? Have you ever stopped to consider how I might feel, living under the same roof as your mother?" "Eleanor?" Just the thought of her name made my blood boil. From the moment she'd moved in after her knee surgery, she'd made my life a living hell. Her constant criticism, her blatant favoritism towards Ben, it was like she took perverse pleasure in belittling me at every turn. "Mom's just set in her ways," Ben said weakly, as if that excused her behavior. "You know how she is." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Yes, I know exactly how she is. She's a manipulative, controlling woman who has never accepted me as part of this family." Ben opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't try to defend her, Ben. Not after everything she's put me through." Memories flooded my mind, unbidden. Eleanor's snide remarks about my cooking, her disdainful looks whenever I tried to assert myself. And through it all, Ben had stood by, either oblivious or unwilling to confront his precious mother. "Do you remember our anniversary dinner last year?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "How she criticized the way I'd set the table, made snide comments about the food I'd spent hours preparing?" Ben's face fell, and I knew he remembered. It had been one of the worst nights of my life, a supposed celebration turned into a humiliating ordeal. "And what did you do?" I pressed on, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You just sat there, letting her tear me down in front of our own children." Lila and Jessie, bless them, had tried to come to my defense that night, but their efforts had only earned them Eleanor's wrath, further fracturing our already strained family dynamics. "I'm sorry, Ava," Ben said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I should have stood up for you, for all of us, but you know how my mother can be." "No, Ben," I cut him off sharply. "I don't want to hear excuses anymore. Not when you've let her walk all over me for years." I thought back to the early days of our marriage, when Ben and I had been so deliriously happy. We'd had our whole lives ahead of us, full of promise and possibility. But somewhere along the way that spark had dimmed, smothered by the weight of Eleanor's constant presence and Ben's complacency. "Do you remember our trip to Napa Valley?" I asked, a wistful smile tugging at my lips despite the pain in my heart. "We were so young and carefree, dreaming of all the adventures we'd have together." Ben's expression softened, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Of course I remember. Those were some of the happiest days of my life." "What happened to us, Ben?" I whispered, my voice cracking with emotion. "Where did that happiness go?" He reached for my hand, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know, Ava, but I want to find it again, with you. I want us to be a team, like we used to be." I searched his face, desperate to believe his words, to trust that he truly meant them. But the shadow of Eleanor's influence loomed large, a constant reminder of the forces working against us. As I looked into Ben's eyes, I knew that our journey back to happiness would be long and arduous. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a determination to reclaim the life and love we'd once shared, no matter what obstacles stood in our way. The weeks following Ben's confession were a whirlwind of emotion. As much as I wanted to believe his promises of change, the sting of his betrayal lingered like a persistent ache. It started with little things: a lingering glance when a woman walked by, a secretive smile as he checked his phone. At first I brushed it off, desperate to cling to the hope that we could salvage our marriage. But then came the late nights at the hardware store, the flimsy excuses about inventory checks and supplier meetings. I knew in my gut that something was amiss, but I was too afraid to confront the truth. That all changed the day Marie Wilkins walked back into our lives. I'll never forget the moment I saw her standing in our driveway, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer clothes a stark contrast to my rumpled house dress. She looked every bit the successful businesswoman she'd become, her confidence radiating like a force field. "Ava," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "It's been too long." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Marie had been Ben's high school sweetheart, the one he'd pined over before settling down with me. And now, after all these years, she was back in our lives like a specter from the past. "What are you doing here?" I managed to ask, my heart pounding in my chest. Marie's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm back in town for good, and I thought I'd stop by and say hello to an old friend." An old friend. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Ben's distant behavior, his late nights, the guilty looks he'd been giving me. "You've been seeing my husband?" I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. To her credit, Marie didn't try to deny it. "Ben and I have reconnected, yes, but it's not what you think, Ava. We're just old friends catching up, reminiscing about the past." I wanted to scream, to lash out at this woman who had so casually waltzed back into our lives and upended everything. But deep down, I knew the blame lay squarely on Ben's shoulders. When he finally came home that evening, I confronted him head-on. "Marie stopped by today," I said, watching as the color drained from his face. Ben opened his mouth, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't bother lying to me, Ben. I know you've been seeing her behind my back." For a moment, he looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But then, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been meeting up with Marie, trying to recapture some of the excitement from our youth." The admission hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. All this time, while I'd been trying to salvage our marriage, he'd been indulging in some twisted midlife crisis. "How could you do this to me, Ben?" I asked, my voice thick with tears. "After everything we've been through together, how could you betray me like this?" He reached for me, but I recoiled from his touch. "Ava, please let me explain." But I didn't want to hear his excuses, his justifications. In that moment, all I felt was a profound sense of betrayal, a realization that the man I'd loved and trusted for decades had been living a lie. As I looked at Ben, I saw a stranger, a man consumed by his own selfish desires, willing to sacrifice everything we'd built for a fleeting taste of his past. And in that moment, I knew that our marriage, our family, had been irrevocably shattered. The only question that remained was whether we had the strength to pick up the pieces and rebuild from the rubble. The weeks following Ben's confession were a whirlwind of emotion. As much as I wanted to believe his promises of change, the sting of betrayal lingered like a persistent ache. We tried to move forward, to rebuild the tattered remnants of our marriage, but a palpable tension hung in the air. Ben's words of reassurance felt hollow, and I found myself questioning every gesture, every glance. It all came to a head during a family dinner when Lila and Jesse joined us. I'd hoped that their presence might help bridge the growing divide between Ben and me, but little did I know it would only serve to widen the chasm. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," Lila began, her expression a mix of concern and determination. Ben and I exchanged a glance, and I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the moment we'd find our way back to each other, to the love that had once bound us so tightly. But then Eleanor opened her mouth and everything unraveled. "Your father and I have been discussing his little indiscretion," she said, her words laced with venom. "And I, for one, think it's time he put an end to this nonsense with that woman." I felt the air leave my lungs, a sickening realization dawning. Eleanor knew about Ben's affair with Marie, and she was using it as ammunition in her never-ending quest to control our family. "Mom, stop," Ben warned, but Eleanor barreled on, her gaze fixed on me. "You've been so focused on your own hurt, Ava, that you've neglected your duties as a wife and mother." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the familiar tendrils of shame and inadequacy wrapping around me. But this time, something was different. This time I had an ally. "That's enough, Grandma." Lila spoke up, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You have no right to speak to Mom like that." Eleanor turned on her, her eyes flashing with fury. "How dare you take her side, after everything she's done to tear this family apart?" "She's not the one who betrayed Dad," Jesse chimed in, his jaw set in a defiant line. "That was you, Grandma, and him." The words hung in the air, a damning indictment of the fractures that had formed in our once tight-knit family. I looked at Ben, silently pleading for him to take a stand, to choose us over the toxic influence of his mother. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table, a myriad of emotions flickering across his face. In that moment, I knew that our marriage had reached a breaking point. The betrayal, the lies, the constant manipulation, it had all become too much to bear. And as much as I loved Ben, as much as I wanted to believe in the promises of change, I knew that we couldn't move forward until we confronted the source of our turmoil head-on. "Ben," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of sadness and resolve, "we can't go on like this. Something has to change." He looked up at me, and I saw the weight of the world in his eyes. A silent acknowledgement passed between us, a recognition that our family was fracturing, and we had to make a choice. As I looked around the table at the strained expressions on Lila and Jesse's faces, at the defiant tilt of Eleanor's chin, I knew that this was the moment that would define our future. We could either crumble under the weight of our dysfunction, or we could rise above it, reclaiming the love and strength that had once bound us together. The choice was ours to make, and in that moment, I knew that I had to be the one to take the first step. The decision to leave my home, my life as I knew it, was one of the most difficult choices I've ever had to make. But in the aftermath of Ben's betrayal, I knew that I couldn't stay trapped in that suffocating existence any longer. I had to find a way to breathe again, to reclaim some semblance of dignity. That's how I found myself taking the leap, accepting a full-time position at the community center. It was a chance to immerse myself in a new world, one where I could rediscover my sense of purpose and self-worth. The work was demanding, but it gave me a renewed sense of accomplishment that had been missing from my life for far too long. In the months that followed, I found myself becoming a part of a vibrant community of women, each of us seeking solace in the shared bonds of our newfound independence. We would gather after our shifts, sharing stories over glasses of wine, and forming a sisterhood stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. It was there, among that circle of kindred spirits, that I first felt the stirrings of a long-forgotten dream. A dream that had been buried beneath years of domestic drudgery and the relentless demands of keeping a home. A dream that had once filled me with a sense of purpose and possibility. What if, I mused aloud one evening, as my new friends listened with rapt attention. What if I finally pursued that degree I'd always longed for? The idea took root, blossoming into a plan that would allow me to reclaim a piece of the identity I'd lost. With a newfound determination, I enrolled in the local community college, taking night classes that would finally allow me to achieve the dream I'd abandoned so many years ago. Suddenly, a whole new world opened up before me, a world where I could finally put my passions to use, where I could build a life on my own terms. It was a revelation that filled me with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. As the months passed, my confidence grew. I found myself thriving in my new role, embracing the challenges that came with juggling work and school. And with each accomplishment, each new milestone, I felt the shackles of my former life slip away. My new friends cheered me on, celebrating each small victory with me over glasses of wine that grew cheaper by the day. They became my tribe, a support system that buoyed me through the darkest days when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm me. It was through their encouragement that I finally decided to take the leap and apply to the local university to complete my degree. A dream I had long since abandoned finally became a reality, and with it, a new path opened up before me. In that moment, I knew that I had reclaimed a piece of myself that had been missing for far too long. A piece that had been slowly chipped away by the demands of keeping a home, of being a provider. The possibility of what my life could become filled me with a sense of hope and possibility I hadn't felt in years. That night, as I poured myself a glass of the cheapest wine I could find, I raised a toast to my newfound independence. A new life was calling, one that was entirely my own. The weight of Eleanor's control over the family had been slowly suffocating me, but with Ava's newfound independence, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that we could forge our own path forward. That's when I knew I had to take a stand against my mother's manipulation, for the sake of my own future, and Ava's. It started with the little things, standing up to Eleanor's criticisms, asserting my own identity. And then as my confidence grew, I began to envision a life without her looming presence, without the weight of her expectations. That's when I made the decision to cut ties with Eleanor, to break free from the cycle of control that had defined our family dynamics for far too long. It was a difficult choice, but one that felt necessary for my own growth and for Ava's sense of self-determination. With a newfound sense of purpose, I took the first steps towards building a life without Eleanor's influence, paving the way for a future where Ava and I could forge our own path together. In that moment, I knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but I was ready to face it head-on with Ava by my side. It was a new beginning, a chance to redefine ourselves and our future, free from the burdens of the past. As we moved forward, I felt a sense of excitement and determination, knowing that we were building a life on our own terms, with a foundation of respect and partnership. The weeks following my confrontation with Eleanor were a whirlwind of emotion. Ben and I found ourselves navigating uncharted territory, trying to rebuild the foundations of our marriage on a bedrock of honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't easy. Years of resentment and hurt had taken their toll, leaving deep scars that would take time to heal. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that we could forge a path forward, free from the toxic influence of Eleanor's manipulation. Ben, to his credit, seemed determined to make amends. He was open and remorseful, acknowledging the ways in which he had failed me, failed us, by allowing his mother to wield such control over our lives. "I was weak, Ava," he confessed one night as we sat together on the porch, the cool evening breeze offering a respite from the emotional turmoil we'd been grappling with. "I let her get into my head, and I lost sight of what really mattered." I reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We both made mistakes, Ben, but what matters now is that we're willing to fight for each other, for our family." He nodded, his eyes shining with a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes, Ava. No more secrets, no more letting my mother dictate our lives." In the weeks that followed, we worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. We went to counseling, laying bare the wounds that had festered for far too long. And slowly, gradually, we began to find our way back to each other. But just as we were starting to gain our footing, a curveball came hurtling our way, one that threatened to upend everything we'd been working towards. It started with a phone call from the nursing home where Eleanor had been staying. She'd suffered a minor stroke, they told us, and while she was stable, the prognosis was uncertain. Ben was beside himself, torn between the desire to stand by his mother in her time of need and the lingering resentment he felt towards her manipulative ways. "I don't know if I can do this, Ava," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything she's put us through, how can I just show up and pretend like nothing happened?" I understood his hesitation, his anger. Eleanor had inflicted deep wounds on our family, and the scars were still raw. But in that moment, I knew that we had a choice to make, a choice that would define the path forward for all of us. "Ben," I said, taking his hand in mine, "this is your chance to break the cycle, to show Eleanor that you're not going to let her control you anymore, but that you're still willing to be there for her as a son should." He searched my eyes, looking for reassurance, for guidance. And in that moment, I knew that the decision rested squarely on my shoulders. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you," I promised. "But think about what kind of man you want to be, what kind of example you want to set for our children and grandchildren." Ben was silent for a long moment, weighing the gravity of the situation. And then, with a deep breath, he made his choice. "I'll go to her," he said, his voice resolute. "But not as the dutiful son she's always expected. I'll go as my own man, on my own terms." As I watched him gather his things, a sense of pride swelled within me. This was the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, a man of strength, of integrity, who was finally ready to forge his own path. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as true partners, united in our determination to build a life defined by love, respect, and the freedom to choose our own destiny. The decision to move Eleanor into a care facility was one of the most difficult choices Ben and I had to make. On one hand, the thought of entrusting her care to strangers felt like a betrayal of the familial bonds that had once held us together. But on the other, the weight of her manipulation and the toll it had taken on our lives was a burden we could no longer bear. In the end, it was a decision born of necessity. A recognition that for our family to truly heal, we needed to establish boundaries and create a space where we could rebuild without the constant specter of Eleanor's influence looming over us. The day we moved her into the facility, a palpable tension hung in the air. Eleanor, ever the master of manipulation, alternated between bouts of feigned frailty and biting remarks, her words aimed like daggers at the heart of our newfound resolve. "You'll regret this," she hissed as Ben and I helped her settle into her new room. "Mark my words, you'll come crawling back, begging for my forgiveness." But Ben, to his credit, remained steadfast. "This is for the best, Mother," he said, his voice tinged with a sadness that betrayed the depth of his internal struggle. "We all need a chance to start over, to heal." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Start over? You think you can just erase decades of history, of the sacrifices I've made for this family?" I placed a gentle hand on Ben's arm, a silent reminder that we were in this together, united against the forces that had once threatened to tear us apart. "No one is erasing anything, Eleanor," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We're simply creating the space we need to move forward, on our own terms." She scoffed, her disdain palpable. "Your terms? Don't make me laugh. You'll see, Ava. In the end, you'll come crawling back, just like everyone else." With those parting words, she turned away from us, her shoulders hunched in a posture of defiant resignation. It was a bitter farewell, but one that felt strangely liberating. As Ben and I left the facility that day, hand in hand, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. It was as if a weight had been lifted, a burden we'd been carrying for far too long finally set down. In the weeks and months that followed, we worked tirelessly to rebuild our lives, to forge a path forward that was defined by our own choices, our own desires. Ben visited his mother regularly, but always with a newfound sense of boundaries and self-respect. And slowly, gradually, the fractures that had once threatened to tear our family apart began to heal. Lila and Jesse, inspired by our journey, found their own paths. Lila pursuing her dreams of becoming a chef, Jesse embracing the role of devoted husband and father. And through it all, They remained a constant source of support, a reminder of the unbreakable bonds that had sustained us through even the darkest of times. As for Ben and me, we rediscovered the love that had first brought us together, that had carried us through the challenges and triumphs of decades past. We learned to communicate openly, to navigate the complexities of our relationship with honesty and compassion. And in those quiet moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm us, we would remind each other of the strength we'd found in our journey, the resilience that had carried us through the storm and into the calm waters of a new beginning. We rebuilt from the ashes, I would whisper to Ben as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. We're a stronger family now, defined by love and respect. And in those moments, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, united in our determination to forge a life that was truly our own.